Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the People Summit. We're so pleased that you could join us today. And we're going to start this morning off in the right way with a land acknowledgement from Elder Marilyn Capreol from Shawanaga First Nation. Marilyn?
Wanabajo, Nabish quiet, Shinakaza Makwado Dam, Shawanaga Donja. I acknowledge Winabajo, Creator's helper, that went out and walked all the lands and acknowledged all living beings before our time, making sure that Creator had painted the spirit of his paintbrush with balance. When we say acknowledge the land, this very special sacred day as we gather, the land began to acknowledge us yesterday, giving us one of the greatest gifts. And at this time of the year, my friend Harvey, he acknowledged the flowers. Well, we just passed through that moon, Waskono Jesus, as your grandmother puts on her beautiful coat, inviting her children to come back and feed. Yesterday, the entire world in our territories acknowledged the work that we are to do, that we are doing, and we as Creator's children will enhance that circle. The first acknowledgement goes to our men. The thunder beams came yesterday and the lightning bolts. That acknowledges our men, allowing us to gather in this special sacred circle. We are passing through the sky world that the men take care of. They look after all those constellations where it is written, the governance of the universe and how each calendar moon walks through on Turtle's back. Nothing changes. They are allowing us to put our footprints and our voices and our spirits in the sky world, in that airspace between Earth Woman and the Sky Man. We thank the men for carrying the sacred bundle of fire. And that gift came yesterday in that renewal as that Nimki brightened up the link between Earth Woman and the sky world. And in the sacredness, we had the greatest gift on earth come to us as well. That is Nibi, that fell from the 7 grandfathers and grandmothers, a bucket of water that sits in that sky world and connected to Earth Woman. Are we going to have a blessed time? Yes, we are. Because this journey began yesterday, making it day 1 of this sacred celebration. We're working as helpers, Skabebe was helpers of creation. When we talk about the land and the work that we know needs to be done. But where that knowledge comes from is the moment that we are conceived. We are placed in that beautiful water lodge. And we hear the songs. We hear the heartbeat of the drum. And it happens the same way for all of us. And then one day we are given light and passage and put down on this earth in a great way. The first acknowledgement we give is that cry. It's not sadness or anything else. It's acknowledgement that we are here. I call it the warrior's cry, but we all did that. Our eyes adjust to that beautiful light. And we always will carry that sound of the water. And we don't forget that first learning in that beautiful lodge. Things are a little bit different these days, though. I looked at Mandy, her sister Mandy, and the beautiful flowers behind her, that water, and the stand tall in those beautiful hills. We call this a summit, this gathering, and it is a place where you gather, and where her lands are that we see are what the old people would have canoed, walked, and took quite a time to gather in those circles, just like we are today. And with it, they brought the goodness of their lands, their animals, the swimmers, the crawlers, the winged ones from their territories, and they shared that balance. That is what we are to do. We have no ownership. We have a shared knowledge system. That is a good thing. I listened to our brother Harvey this morning, and he spoke in his knowledge language as we listened to Mandy in her language to address the same identity. With that, we call this transference of knowledge a cultural care, so that all things, how we see them, are respected on an equal balance. That is the same blessing when Winnebago walked the earth, and making sure that that was balanced. In this sacred gift of this pandemic that is giving us a different kind of teaching, a different way of moving things and celebrating. People were frightened. And I knew last fall that we were going to be okay. I called my cousin, and I love being old. When you can't hear, right? You think you hear, but you don't. You have your own hearing sense. So I phoned my cousin, see how they were over there in that house. So his wife answers. She says, "Oh, he's downstairs." And I thought she said, looking after his toes. So I'm thinking, oh, what's the matter with him? The first thing you think, looking after your toes and old. You think about diabetic ways. So he comes to the phone, and I ask very gentle, "Cousin, what's the matter with your toes?" He says, "What toes?" He said, "I was just downstairs looking and feeding my toad." So anyway, the sacredness of that toad moving into his house to be cared for is something from our young time where we learn everything. So when we were small, we had all the little things outside. We didn't have plastic toys, didn't know what plastic was then. If you found driftwood, that became part of your fort, part of your little kitchen outside. But our aunties and our granny, there were things that we were not to touch, that we were to respect. And that is part of that learning where we are today, respect. And they said, you don't bother the toads. Now, when you look at that toad, that sacred toad, it comes to this earth old. Skin's wrinkled and got spots on it. And it has a very quiet way of speaking. Got lumps all over his back, her back, and they come born like that. But our grannies and aunties, they said, you don't bother them because they are very sacred beings. Creator put them here, and those little bumps are the knowledge. They're the teachers. They're the sacred bundles. So everything on this earth has a responsibility to how we go around. So we as humans are not the superior beings. We are the workers and making sure that all things are in a good way. As we wait this spring for our little ones to come back, bees and other little things that we're used to seeing, I feel like those grandmothers waiting for the children to come home, from school or work or whatever. They used to watch, see if we were coming, because we had to travel by boat. I live in a water community. I was born here. But they watched and they waited, just like I am, and the people that we talk here about the land care. The medicines are here, and they are so abundant this year. Look behind our sister Mandy there, that young woman, the abundance. It is like that here too. So the earth is preparing us for the type of work that we need to do to recognize the plants. And because there are so many, it is teaching us a lesson as well. Some plants will come this year because of the low water, and that is a natural cycle. And it's teaching us not to greed, to be respectful, to harvest only what we need. First, supplying the ones that can't walk in the bush anymore or go on the boat to go and get them. You look after your elders first. Then you think about the ones that have brought new babies to this earth. That sacred gift of life that continues. And we go and gather for that family as well. Because that mother and father, they have extra responsibilities and care of that little wee one. And the ones that are leaving this earth, we have that responsibility to make sure that those medicines are harvested for that journey when they're called upon. So having plenty does not mean that we harm. That's a great teaching, to be respectful with Earth Woman and what is provided. But I'm still waiting for the bees to come. And I haven't seen them. They're the pollinators. So in our gathering of today and the next few days of this 4-day journey, because it began yesterday with Creator, we have to be mindful, put our prayers and put our thoughts into the ones that we're still waiting for, to hope that they didn't get sick and that they return. In the responsibilities today, I offer my words in this language. But in terms of a prayer, I'd like to sing a song from a woman that gave great determination, great respect, and taught us even more. I'd like to sing this song to honor all the water walkers and the walkers that are going to take on care of those that carry the water bundles, the women. I respect the men that have kept the fires lit for today and for the next 3 days until our journey is finished. The song was birthed in a good way to acknowledge our grandmother, Kokam, Josephine Ba, the late Josephine Mundaman. We can do anything because she showed us that we could. She went for Vision Quest when she was 60 years old. Most of us look for best hotel when you're traveling. Who's got, you got these check marks, who's got the best beds and who's got the best breakfast, but not our grandma. She went on that Vision Quest, and while she was gone, the water people spoke to her. Earth Woman spoke to her that way. But when it was time to break that vision, that fasting for her, she went back into that lodge, the sweat lodge. There was feasts, and that after the feasting, there is an opportunity to share what is it that you were gifted with. And she talked about the water, all about the water in her vision. And her people asked, what are you going to do about that? You've been given a gift. And she did a gift that will walk forever. The awareness of life itself, the water. And as the young women and the old women began to walk with her, even if it was a short way, if they couldn't walk, maybe they gave $2. It bought something for the people that walked with her. I met her the year that she began to walk in my own territory. I had this old red car. My husband had this old red car that I got to drive, let's put it that way. And I'm going to get gas for my boat because I worked on the water then, and get some groceries that would feed myself and a few other people around the island. I saw this eagle staff coming down up over the hill. And I thought, wow, this is something serious. So I parked the car, got out of that old red car, went across, and that's the day that I met Kokam. And she shared her story in that short little way. They had this old, I don't know, kind of like a Volkswagen bus, one of those new RVs that they have today. I think it was Volkswagen that made them. I turned around and I went back to our gas station in our territory. And the only thing that I could give was to listen to her story, let it sit in my heart and my eyes and everything that I know today, the vision of that eagle staff and that Kokam carrying that pail of water. Horse flies, sick on the road because it was summer. And I gave all the money that I had for my gas. And I just started to go through my head, what do I need in groceries? Well, I didn't need as much as the people did. And she affected people like this all over the world. We have these fancy words of today, But they began somewhere, and these words that we've been gifted came through her. So in saying that, I'm going to offer this prayer song. We weren't able to pass tobacco to one another. But when we sit and listen to one another, we are still doing that giving and receiving. And you have to mentally take care of the offering. So if it is not tobacco, we do have water. And if you have a little glass of water in front of you, I'd like you to raise it. Ni be besong kiko kimi kwecho we miniko kicho we niko ni be besong kiko ni be kesong keko kimi kwecho we miniko kisho we miniko ni be kesong keko kimi kwecho we miniko kisho we miniko. Oh, Chimiquich. Oh, Chimiquich. Oh, Chimiquich. It says, I love you. I thank you and I respect you. Very simple words. So let Grandmother Cookham, Josephine Baugh, the spirit of her energy, if she could walk the amount of miles today, tomorrow, and the next day and the week after, going to be real easy for us. So with that, I'm going to say enjoy your time, as we had received all of those natural gifts yesterday. And when I got on that boat to come home last night, I got off on my dock over here, and the Loon family came to sing. And I think about them, my hair would go straight up if I didn't have gel on it. They are so magic. And they are the keepers of the sacred vow. So with that, say miigwech, enjoy, love, and respect. Janet, I now pass you the feather. And miigwech for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Elder Capreol. We are deeply enriched by your words and your prayers. I appreciate everything you've had to say this morning. Thank you. Just want to take a slight pause and just sort of absorb that myself. So I'm going to move on now to the rest of the day. We have a spectacular day, a spectacular 3 days. We are expecting 50 speakers over the 3 days. We will be hearing from many Indigenous nations. I believe we have 14, perhaps more. And we are very blessed to have some very important people, known as VIPs, speaking with us. And we're going to kick off this morning with that. but I'll maybe just start with a few housekeeping rules so that you understand the nature of the engagement here. Over these 3 days, we please encourage you to participate in all 3 days, and that you can access all of the workshops and summit experiences through the link that you will have been using this morning. You are viewing a webinar, so you will have you'll have your audio and your video will remain off, so you can see us, but we can't see you, and you can ask questions using the Q&A, and those will be fed to me because we're actually on a Zoom call that's feeding the webinar. Hence some of our delay this morning in getting things up and running, because it's this new blending of these two realities. And so your questions will be fed through to us, and we can answer those questions. And even if we don't get to your question, we will be getting to your question in follow-up. So maybe I'll just pause on the housekeeping. From there, you can ask your questions, as I said, in the Q&A if you're having any difficulty or trouble. If you go to the website, peoplesummit.ca, you can see the agenda, you can see the declaration, you can see all of the speaker bios. So we're not going to spend much time in introducing every single person by their biography, but rather letting them have as much time to speak as we possibly can. This morning, we're going to kick off the entire summit by creating a bit bigger worldview and the context for all of this work. We are very pleased to have with us Deputy Grand Chief Mandy Gull, and she'll share her expertise and experience in protecting EU ISG. I had some language lessons on that this morning from my colleague Anna, in the James Bay territory on the Quebec side. And recently the Cree Nation there, Cree Nation government and Quebec announced that more than 20% of the territory will be protected, and Deputy Grand Chief Gull will share why she fought so hard and what she accomplished in doing so. And I was very, very pleased to listen to Deputy Grand Chief speak at the Nature-Based Solutions Summit pre-pandemic, when we were able to do it live, and she's an amazing speaker. And I believe we're going to have Harvey kick us off. Now, I've worked with Harvey for many years. In fact, we were just discussing this morning as we were going through some of our technical difficulties, the challenges that Harvey and I have encountered over the years, whether it's using flash drives or how to make a Zoom work. And we get a chance to interact in that friendly a fashion for many, many years. And I am very pleased to have Harvey with us. Make sure to check out the bios by visiting the website. But Harvey's going to speak to what's at stake and how Ontario and Canada can actually lean in and lead on biodiversity and addressing that crisis that we have with the collapse of the natural world. And so, Harvey, I'm going to kick it over to you and allow you to lead away.
Thank you, Janet. Great to be here. Thank you, Elder Capreol, for those wonderful opening remarks. While you were speaking, a thunderstorm and lightning came in around me here in Banff. It was very moving. Thank you so much. Could I have the slideshow, please? Thank you. So let's talk about Ontario and how Ontario fits into a nature-positive world. This is a really interesting time to be alive. We have some pretty significant challenges about the context for all life. This is a statement from the Secretary General of the United Nations that rolls up a whole bunch of science that's been coming at us in big ways for a long time. The state of the planet is broken. Humanity is waging a war on nature, a suicidal war, and making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century and should be everyone's top priority. That's a pretty powerful statement. There's three things we need to do to turn this around. We need to protect nature, we need to shift to more sustainable production methods, and we need to shift to more sustainable consumption methods. It's this troika, these three things we need to do. I'm going to focus on the protecting nature part. Protected areas are the foundation of biodiversity conservation, nature conservation. Have been for a long time. It's because they work. If you want to see the proof of that, think of large mammals. Lions, grizzly bears, bison, tigers, elephants, they've all been crashing in their population as humans just lose their tolerance for living with these other species. However, there's a happy exception to that, and that's the exception of protected areas. We know that protected areas are effective to save nature. They've worked all over the world in that way. If you look at our continent, North America, this is a map of the large protected areas in North America. You can see them in purple. This is a map of the distribution of large mammals in North America historically on the left. So this is before European settlers arrived, and on the right today. You can see there was a wide distribution of large mammals. So think bison, grizzly bears, wolves, big things on the left historically, and on the right you can see where they are now. White means none. So there were buffalo in Buffalo, New York. That's why it's called that. Now, of course, there are no buffalo in Buffalo, New York. And you can see the dwindling of wildness in much of the landscape down to one dark color of green. That's basically white-tailed deer, an animal that can get along in fragmented habitats. Look to the left, see the large protected areas, look to where the large mammals persist. It's an extraordinary correlation. This works in Africa for large mammals, it works in India for large mammals, it works in Southeast Asia, it works everywhere. This is an important lesson for us. The flip side of that is where we haven't created any protected spaces, we have a biodiversity crisis. Huge numbers of species at risk, ecosystems themselves at risks. We have estuaries adjacent to such areas that are becoming dead zones. And these are called crisis ecoregions. This was recognized 30 plus years ago with the Brundtland Report. And the Brundtland Report told us that, well, we have 3 to 4% of the world in protected areas. What we need to do is at least triple it. And this was the origin of the goal of protecting 10% globally or 12% in Canada. If you remember the Endangered Spaces Campaign, Lands for Life, the idea of protecting 12% came from this. In 2010, the world realized that was nowhere near enough, so they came up with slightly increased targets called the Aichi targets of 17% for the ocean, for the land, and 10% for the ocean. Now this target, of course, was a political target. It wasn't a target derived from any knowledge. And immediately people like me were publishing things saying, well, how come the policymakers are down here when the science is we need to protect far more than that? We need to be protecting in the range of half of these systems. We know that. Why are we talking about 17% and 10%? This led to things like the Nature Needs Half movement or Wilson's book, Half Earth. And I was appointed chair of a committee about 5 years ago to ask the question and get a scientific consensus on what is need to be done on the protection side for the world. And this is a survey that led by Stephen Woodley that my task force did, our task force did. We surveyed the biggest survey of conservation scientists ever done. Of the world, 81 countries, 363 scientists. And we asked, what do you think of this target of 17% land and 10 ocean? Answer, nowhere near sufficient. Simply not sufficient. We asked, what do you think of bigger targets like 30% or half, those ideas like Nature Needs Half and Half Earth? 78% of scientists strongly agreed with those ideas. Now, we opened in a good way with an awareness of the first people. This is Grand Chief Herb Norwegian. He was one of the first people to talk about the need to protect half the world. He's with the Decho Dene, and their land use plan, derived from traditional knowledge and Western science, said they should protect at least half their territory. And in fact, Herb at the World Wilderness Congress in Alaska in 2005 said he believed every Indigenous person should want to protect at least half of their traditional territory to maintain traditional connection to the land and traditional values. So this knowledge system from Indigenous knowledge informs the idea of nature needs half just as much as Western science does. We did also the largest literature review ever done of information published on what percentage of the land needs to be protected in various ways of assessment, ecoregional assessment, species representation needs. And the range is 30 to 70%, with half being a very normal median in those numbers. And this is really the scale we need to be thinking of, protecting half of the world in an interconnected way. This has been recognized now increasingly. This Convention on Biological Diversity, a big nature convention, had its technical meetings in May. Here's the filing from France. France said, we agree that we should be focusing on a 30% protection target as an interim measure, but 50% protection is what's needed. Here's the EU statement saying we need to protect at least 30% and some point to the need to protect 50%. So these are the formal filings on behalf of that country and that continent. Here's where we are, however. And the world scale, 17% of the land is protected and 7.5% of the global ocean. And on the ocean side, some of those standards are not so high. How would you protect so much of the world, given the reality of how people use the world? This can be done by thinking about how the world is, the conditions of the world. 18% of it is that cities and farms kind of crisis ecoregion state. On the other end of the scale, 27% more or less is in a very large, intact wild condition still. And about half of the world is in that in-between state where we'd have resource extraction, but still wildness. There are people doing various things in the landscape, but it's not entirely transformed. Cities and farms is at least half transformed or more, sometimes 100% transformed. So if we look at the world as it is, we can develop strategies to address that. This is North America by those three conditions. You see the wild north. You see the fertile areas in dark brown there, the cities and farms. That's where most of us live. And the yellow areas are those shared lands. This weekend, the G7 leaders, so Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Johnson, President Biden, and the other countries, all said the world must not only become net zero for carbon, we must also become nature positive. And they said they will support and drive new global targets to conserve or protect at least 30% of the land and sea by 2030. This is important. This is actually good leadership from our top political figures in the G7 countries. So where's Ontario in all of this? Well, I'm not going to make you proud here, I'm afraid. I'm going to take you through a little bit of reality. Ontario, of course, has these three conditions. You've got the wild north, you've got the shared landscape in the middle, and you've got the heavily developed south. What does that look like? Well, here's a species at risk map showing that most species at risk are in the south, less in the shared land, and very few in the northland. This is a map of the crisis ecoregions of Canada. You'll remember I showed the crisis ecoregions of the world. This is a recent study showing in bright red the most species-rich crisis ecoregions in the country. If you survey the country, look at southern Ontario and along the St. Lawrence, and you will see important crisis ecoregions, biodiversity-rich, and in real trouble. And here's how much of Ontario is protected. 11.1%, 3,000 hectares protected in the last 10 years when the global target was 17%. So there's work to be done, Ontario. Good news now. We have an ambitious federal strategy to back up those fancy words at the G7. We have Minister Wilkinson is in charge of getting 25% of Canada protected by 2025 and 30% by 2030. For some reason, I've got 2050 in the slide. That's 2025. And he's adopted this approach of a southern strategy that engages people with nature, does restoration, saves species at risk, recreates ecological corridors, a mid-Canada strategy of interconnected protected areas and good industrial practices, and a wild north strategy that engages in keeping things intact. And this is a comprehensive strategy for both the climate and nature. Whoops, I hit the wrong advanced mechanism. So what might this look like? Well, in southern Ontario, it can look like this. You can find ecological corridors coming off the green belt. You can see that on the left. You get down to a finer scale like Burlington, and you can imagine a corridor being constructed of various land ownership categories from coots to escarpment. We can do this at every scale, and we need to do it at every scale. In the middle scale, we need to protect and restore. This is a picture from Sumatra where A palm plantation has been replanted to bring back orangutan habitat on the edge of Gunung Loser National Park. Here, where I live, there's this corridor, the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, which is sort of a pioneer of the idea of connecting large landscapes across this middle condition. In Ontario, you have something very similar with Algonquin to Adirondacks. You can connect that Adirondack State Park in the US across the Frontenac Arch to Algonquin. And while you're at it, you can maybe make Algonquin Park into a real park, which would be absolutely marvelous instead of a partial park, which it is now. Janet can tell you more. We can build highway crossing structures. These are structures here in Banff, which are the most famous system in the world. They allow life to flow across the roads while our commercial life and personal lives flow across the landscape. We can share the world with the rest of life through structures like this. But the other big thing that we need to bear in mind is that these remaining large wild areas, of which Canada is one of the great hosts, are important to the very function of the planet. This is the Amazon rainforest. It's actually raining from the forest here. Half the rain in the Amazon is generated by the forest cover. You can see the mist rising out of the trees. If you lose the forest, you lose the rain, and you have a change in the global weather system. Caribou in our continent, woodland caribou require 2/3 intact landscapes. In other words, you can't mess with it more than 1/3, or you simply lose the woodland caribou. And we are losing the woodland caribou all over the country. It's really simple. We have to keep those large wild areas intact if we want to keep caribou. And in terms of our boreal forest peatlands, they are one of the most essential things to the functioning of the planet, to the stability of our climate. They store vast amounts of carbon, they absorb more carbon, and when we dry them or disturb them, that carbon is released to the atmosphere and makes climate change worse. This is a profoundly important issue for our world. If you look at the questions of biodiversity, so especially species richness and carbon in nature, and you look at where the priorities, the highest priorities on Earth, I've circled them. Look at Canada and look at Northern Ontario in particular. Holy smokes, it's in the same as the Amazon or the Congo or Southeast Asia. We need to protect that carbon in nature to serve the planetary well-being, the health of the world. This is from last week. There was a workshop of the IPCC, which is the body that advises the Climate Convention, and IPBES, which advises the Biodiversity Convention. And they made this statement: avoiding or reversing loss and degradation of carbon and species-rich ecosystems on land and in the ocean is of the highest importance for combined biodiversity, climate change mitigation, and adaptation co-benefits. Highest importance. This is a boreal forest wetland on the left. This is a boreal forest wetland on the right, where logging operations have occurred. We do not consider this to be an impact on the land for the purpose of climate change on the right in Canada. This is just unbelievable. All the carbon there is disturbed and emitted to the sky. We don't count it. We think that we actually pretend that forestry doesn't have an impact on the climate in Canada. It's not true. It does. Clearly it does here. And Janet's got a report on these logging scars that will tell you all about that. If we look at the land, in addition to the carbon that's on the land around James Bay and Hudson Bay, of course, there's going to be carbon in the sediments of the ocean. And there's very, very, very rich marine life. I'm super delighted that Deputy Chief Mandy Gull is going to speak to you next about one side of this wonderful bay system. But a huge part of it is Ontario. It's a globally significant thing on land and water. And if we talk about, as we opened with Indigenous peoples live all across Canada in different ways in different places. And just like there are sort of 3 conditions for us, there are 3 conditions of different relationships. All of it is important. All of it is super important to us to understand how we can live better in this world. And reconciliation, for the TRC said, there can be no reconciliation among peoples until there is reconciliation with Mother Earth. That means all of us have to be involved in that. And this is the change we need. Okay. On the left is the sort of idea of sustainable development practice as an intersection between the environment, the economy, and society, looking for that sweet spot in the middle, that little green triangle there. Oh, when we get that right, we're good. No, that's wrong. On the right is reality. Here's the environment, the whole earth, where we all live, where we share the world with the rest of life, and inanimate things in our language. Inside that is a human society. That's where we're born, we live, we die, we love. And inside that is the economy, which is only there to serve the human society. It does not serve the greater environment, and it doesn't have a life of its own. It's a derivative thing to serve people. And we've got to get this framework right. And right now we're letting the economy destroy the home of people and all of their life. This is not sensible. This is a bad way to see the world. And we need to change that. And I was absolutely moved by Elder Capreol's statement. We humans are not superior beings. We are the workers to make sure all things are in a good way. That's the conceptual shift we need to make. We have this idea as a metrical goal of a global goal for nature, of a nature positive world by 2030. The G7 statement talked about that. We need to bend the curve of the loss of nature and have more nature by 2030, and we need to get to a fully flourishing world after that. We need to reverse trajectories here, change course. And fundamentally, we have to have an integrated top-level goal across all of our conventions, all of our behaviors, land use in Ontario, right through to the world. We need to get to this idea of an equitable, nature positive, and carbon neutral world. Then we can have hope for the 21st century. Then we can have reconciled our relationship with each other and with the rest of life. And it gives us hope for a bright future. So thanks for the chance to share some thoughts. All these papers and stuff are on this website, or an awful lot of them. If you want to go there, you can read all about it. Thank you so much, Janet, for the honor of being here. And as you say in your part of the world, miigwech.
Thank you, Harvey. I really appreciate that. I get a chance to hear you in person so many days, but it's so fabulous that you can share this wealth of knowledge with the rest of us. And for anybody who's wondering, all of these recorded sessions will be available on the People Summit going forward. So don't worry about it. If you didn't catch all of it, you'll be able to go back and rewatch Harvey in all his glory. And now we're very pleased to welcome Deputy Chief Mandy Gull.
Thank you, Wajak. Good morning. Janet. Nistam guy, and we have Malganjit EU that have Odeschimol Jaimo Mikanji Sagojit, and Nishneve EU Snanako is not so Mshafa factory Wajempno. That's Kedrick Madna Otnaha Nemeskati that said just you meet no. Ninskumalga, Coco Marilyn Gayemet Nashajimio Togaji, Eji the Bajamot Neshkeji, Imomat Amo. Agunji se web make it chayot, Trinas compnom se pahpek chayot kabets the mention to make. For those of you who are not fluent in Cree, I wanted to first of all start by acknowledging the territory of the Anishinaabe people in Ontario. There are many communities, as I'm not going to list them all, but for the different nations, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, there are many, and I'd like to acknowledge your territory. And also that I'm joining you from my own Cree territory in the community of Nemaska, the capital of Iwischi, the heart of Iwischi, as we call it. I would also like to thank Gukum Elder Marilyn for sharing her wisdom with us this morning, and especially for speaking about the bees. I think that's something that I have really come to be aware of these past few years, is noticing the rapid decline of the bees. And I strongly encourage each and every one of you to assist the bees by, letting your dandelions grow a little bit more often, which I think is hard for us to do, but is essential for our survivor. As she said, they are the pollinators. I'd like to just address 3 key points today before I begin. I would like to acknowledge the discovery of the 215 children in Kamloops, BC. Yesterday, my nation held a residential school response press conference where we addressed the the discovery of the graves of these children, and unfortunately, the increasing number of these children who were victims of the residential school system. And it has been something that has been very challenging for First Nations across Canada. It was a very heavy day in our nation yesterday, and we continue to stand with the individuals in Kamloops and the families that have uncovered these tragic stories. And today is a very special day. It is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. So I encourage you to show love to your gukums and your jumshums, your grandparents, and take care of them, take time to share with them, and really learn your family history, or learn the history of your nation. And even if you are non-Indigenous, to learn the history of your family, because it is valuable information that will carry you forward and really help you understand who you are. I have a bit of a raspy throat because I traveled yesterday and I came in quite late, so I'm very tired, but I'm very, very pleased to be joining you guys today to tell the story of the Cree Nation territory. I want to thank Marie-Ève, our birthday girl, for asking me to participate today. Happy birthday. I'm wishing you well wishes, Marie-Ève, health, happiness, and joy. And of course, it is such a pleasure to follow Harvey in his presentation. I was really impressed by the information that you shared. One of the biggest takeaways for me was the nature positive message that he sent. And that's one of trying to achieve 50% protection. And this is a very, very challenging task, but I'm very proud to tell the story of my nation and how we are working on that exact target. We are trying to set aside 50% of our territory, our traditional territories, for conservation and protection. Iwishik is an extremely large territory. I think our territory spans about 1/3 of northern Quebec. We are 10 communities. We have 20,000 members. More than 50% of our members are under the age of 18. So we are a very, very young nation. We have many future generations that are already playing on the streets of our communities. And I'm very fortunate to see these kids growing up as I travel throughout the communities. I want to also acknowledge that we are one of the nations that has been heavily impacted by development in our territory. We did sign the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, which was a treaty that we entered into because our territories were impacted by hydroelectric development in the north. In addition, throughout the years, we've been impacted by significant forestry activities. And especially in the southern portion of the Cree territory, there's been a lot of forestry activities, and we've been really trying to work on setting aside and protecting untouched landscapes. And this has been some of the ongoing work here at the Cree Nation government and at the local level for over 10 years. We've responded to many things that have been brought into the territory, and we've also responded to actions taken by the governments, both provincial and federal, within USG. So today I'm going to share information. First, I'd like to highlight that you can find this story if you want more information on our website, euconservation.ca, EEYOU, which is the Cree word for Cree. So you know a little bit of Cree. And I also want to share about the importance of how conservation has affected USG, because it is something that follows the principle of Mi'kmaq. And Mi'kmaq translates into being alive well. And I truly believe that the landscape of USG is something that contributes not only to our existence as Cree, but our identity as Cree. One of the most significant events that really pushed forward for me an understanding of what conservation meant for USG was having the privilege to be part of a campaign to save the broadback, which is one of the old growth forests in our territory. I'm from the community of Waswanipi. It is the most southern of the 9 Cree communities in the territory. And our community territories are divided into trap lines. We have 63 trap lines. Only 10% of those trap lines have been untouched by forestry activities. So for me to be able to go to the Broadback River Valley, which is an old growth forest, completely untouched, was such a life-changing experience and has really defined my path in my career in serving my nation, because of the fact that I had come from a trap line that was heavily, heavily impacted by forestry. It was completely normal to me to see tree after tree after tree, the same tree perfectly lined up, growing, all green. And I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think anything of seeing tree planters coming in and logging trucks driving by. And until I had been invited to the Bradback River Valley and walked in that old growth forest and saw the lichen and saw the diversity of mixed forests and saw the habitat of wildlife that were, you know, just roaming around in the Bradback, it really, really made me realize the importance of keeping our territory safe. So that had been a launching pad for me to really come to understand. And my career started with trying to support my community in achieving this protection. And it's still an ongoing battle. We have made significant wins, but of course you can always protect more. I think if you can protect everything, that's the ultimate goal. But we continue to work in collaboration with the provincial government to try to achieve additional measures of protection. For us, one of the biggest responses that we had in the territory was when the Cree responded to the announcement of a plan for the development of the north in Quebec, which was Plan Nord. This was in the 2010s, early 2010s, we started to hear rumblings of this. And it was one of the things that we felt we had to prepare by undertaking the creation of a conservation strategy. So we appointed various members to sit on this table, and we had all of the 10 communities sitting with us, the environment department, and we really took a regional approach. We took an approach that was guided by a set of targets that identified key bullets, I'll say, that we wanted to hit when working on conservation in the territory. We wanted to identify and set aside areas of conservation before we planned for any type of economic development. And some of those key ideologies that we wanted to follow was really to ensure that there was an interconnectedness of a network of conservation areas. We did not want to see little islands of protection. We wanted to be sure that they were harmonized, that they were adjacent to one another, and that they were almost, I guess, pathways for the wildlife to travel throughout. We really took into account the significant presence of different types of food sources. We are a nation that continues to hunt, fish, and trap. Those rights are protected by the JBNQA, and we have members that, you know, still today live in the bush, full-time hunting, fishing, and trapping. Their rights are protected to do so. So we wanted to reflect that in our protected areas work. We wanted to also build capacity in the Cree Nation and ensure that those who participated were going to gain not only cultural knowledge, but scientific knowledge, and would help in the planning and the management of protected areas. We wanted to build that capacity throughout the Cree territory. And of course, we wanted to start building that information with our youth. So we wanted to have our youth engaged in all aspects of our strategy. And of course, we wanted to be sure that we reflected the principle of resilience in the work that we do. You know, we were not only planning for a response to conservation, we were really looking at where this conservation would take us into the future and what kind of impact our decisions would make on the generations to come. And I think that's something that has been really a really great learning experience for me, because we looked at so many different elements when trying to plan these protected areas that I was able to really work with a team that projected information, you know, sometimes up to 300 years in the future, to think about how climate would have an impact on our territory. And we see it, you know, it's I would say, what in the early beginning of our work, and we already see it this year. In the north, one of our northern communities suffered a landslide, which was one of the largest landslides that we've ever seen in our territory. And it was because of a rapid shift in our spring weather. Our goose hunt was extremely impacted. There was not a lot of harvesting of geese. So we see the activity, you know, where our tallyman, our land users, our hunters were able to travel on the ice up until early June. This year, they were not able to use their skidoos to get back to their camps, already starting in the month of April. So there is a significant shift in our landscape. And I think that really drives the importance of us to ensure that whatever we've prepared or whatever we've written also follows the principle of being adaptive, that we're adapting to the rapid changes in our territory, because that's something that we want to respond to. As I had mentioned earlier, in 2015, the Quebec government announced their plan to develop Plan Nord, and they had also committed to protection of 20% by 2020. They have also announced a target to have an additional 30% in the northern, throughout Quebec. For us, the Crees, we followed that announcement, but we also identified that we wanted to have a significant protection set aside for USG, and we endeavored to gather information for up to 20% of the territory of the Cree. We had a lot of protected areas in place already. We were very fortunate to have these areas set aside, but we really wanted to ensure that we had large landscapes that were contributing to the goals of the Cree. To do this work, I've had an amazing team of women, all women. I love to promote that because I'm really proud of them, who traveled throughout the territory and who went to every single community and spoke with the land users and gathered information that was extremely valuable to us, which was cultural information. And they took this information by sitting down with our land users, by having focus groups, by holding different kinds of sessions in different scales, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes in a community setting, sometimes in a community meeting. And they really gathered information that reflected different types of principles for what cultural information we wanted to gather. And this ranged from traditional knowledge, traditional portages, traditional trails that we had followed, historical sites where we had gathered, where families would meet in the summer and the winter, looking at wildlife habitats, different types of medicines, different types of species that were at risk or endangered, areas that had a significant association with legends, Cree stories. We really wanted to capture this information. And all of this cultural data was gathered and mapped out, and we entered it into a system, a computer system. And with the support of NGO partnerships, we were able to take this traditional information and merge it with scientific information. There was many steps to really identify those scientific principles. The first one was to identify the disturbance in the territory, and for us to really identify what kind of impact the territory had seen, the human footprint, the different types of projects that had taken place, disturbance by hydroelectricity and forestry. And most importantly, the work that we undertook looked at watersheds. For us, we wanted to ensure that we were protecting headwaters, significant water sources in the territory that fed major rivers and into streams that were, parts of biological diverse areas. And when we worked on this, we looked at trying to capture information on a diversity of landscapes. So we also took into consideration different wetlands in the territory, the elevation, the impact, the future impact of climate, just a variety of information. And we took all of this information, we merged it together, and we put it into this computer system, and the computer spat out different types of models that each of the communities could look at and make a selection from. That was really important for us, to not just take information and then say, here, this was the best scenario for your community. We offered them a variety of scenarios to really look at and reflect on, and to decide which areas that they would choose. And for me, I think that was one of the hardest things as a leader, is to ask my people to decide what they would choose, because so many times we would be in these sessions and, our tally man would just circle their entire trap line, and then you'd have to explain to them, no, actually we can only pick certain areas. We want to pick these areas that have been untouched, that will stay untouched, that have the greatest chance of being untouched. So it was a really big learning curve for me, and I think it was a learning curve for our hunters and our land users to understand what that meant. And of course, we always had to give them information for them to know that this work was being undertaken, and this was the first step. This 20% area that we were going after was the first tool in the toolbox, and that we would also be coming for information for the 30%, and that there was other mechanisms of protection that we were also teaching them about, and we wanted them to understand that, you know, the work that was being undertaken was going to be continuous and would be built upon and would most likely be never ending because of the size of USG. We were able to submit our proposals to the Cree Quebec Table on Environment and Protected Areas at the end of 2019. There was a lot of going back and forth between the two parties. Our proposals were reviewed by the Quebec government, also reviewed by each department, the Natural Resources Department, the department that looks at forestry, hydro. You know, each of these departments had their own idea of, you know, what the potential would be for development in the north, and for them to come with those principles as opposed to us really trying to set aside areas that had significant cultural importance. There were challenges in those processes, but you know, I'm very pleased to say that although Quebec came with a desired target of biodiversity, and we had come to the table with a target of significant cultural importance and wildlife habitats, we were able to come to a consensus when we layered our maps over one another. The cultural knowledge and the cultural information reflected biodiversity in its own. So I'm always pleased to share the message that I believe that Indigenous knowledge is of equal value to that of Western and scientific knowledge, because our elders were able to prove biodiversity with their own understanding of how they were stewards of their traplands and the landscape that they were watching over. We now have significant green spaces in Quebec. We were able to achieve the 20% target. In fact, we also, at the end of our negotiation, walked away with an additional 10,000 square kilometers of protection, because we had asked our land users to really give us as much information as they could. We did not cap them when we asked them to set aside areas, but we were able to use these additional spaces to go in and negotiate and really secure the boundaries of what they were looking for. There were adjustments in the process, but I was very pleased to see that, you know, what we had requested had essentially been achieved between the two parties. Now the traditional territory of USG does have green spaces and does have protected areas that are roughly the size of Iceland if you would merge them all together. So it is a very significant space. And I'm very pleased that, you know, when we look at these protected areas, they are areas that we hope to see become EU parks that will be managed by the Cree, and that we will operate programming, and that we will have visitors to come and see the beauty of USG. We're very fortunate that we were one of the groups that applied to the Challenge Fund, and we had a lot of funding awarded to our project. So this funding is going to be used for for setting up these green spaces and identifying the different landscapes. We're doing research projects on specific wildlife habitats, continuing to look at water sources. We're funding spaces to give them access to use the protected areas, giving our youth funding so that they can portage and canoe and snowshoe through the protected areas, providing funding to women's groups, providing funding and doing an assessment of the ecotourism potential within the protected areas, because we want people to come and see these areas. We don't want them to be set aside and untouched and undisturbed. We actually want people to enjoy the beauty of USG and what we have to offer in terms of our story as EUJ, our teaching, our language, our history with the territory. It is one that, you know, if ever you want to know about the Cree, I strongly encourage you to Google, because we have a very, I believe, interesting history as one of the nations within Quebec. In addition, you know, we did all of this work on the 20%, and now we're starting to have our discussions with the communities to identify this 30%. So I'm pleased that we're going to continue building and buffering these areas that we've set aside. And we've also started to talk about, at the local level, within the Category 1 territories that are owned and operated and managed directly by the community, looking at historical sites that are of significant importance to the community and declaring these areas IPCAs, because I truly believe that as Indigenous people, we have to take the lead on defining and calling and naming the spaces that we want to keep safe, and that teaching others why those areas have significant history and why they are important to that community. So this is something that I really look forward to supporting our communities and undertaking. And as Harvey had mentioned, one of the files that we were very pleased to also announce was the creation of an eel marine conservation in James Bay. The Cree Nation has two types of Crees. We have inland Crees, which is myself. We don't have any access to the bay, but we are people who go on the lakes, go on the rivers. And then we're called Nuchmi Iyut. And then on the coast, we have the coastal Crees who have access to the bay. They're called Winnipeg Iyut. So all of these communities are immediately adjacent to Hudson's Bay, James Bay. And seeing the type of work that we did terrestrially and being able to take that information and now learn about what it would mean to create a marine conservation area has been a really enjoyable experience for me. We did do a joint announcement with Canada a little over 2 years ago. We've signed an MOU, and my staff and I were participating in the steering committee to identify what it means to do a feasibility study in the conservation area. We have a lands claim agreement where we've been able to secure ownership of some of the islands, and we've also been undertaking a lot of marine planning. So to see that there's the potential of a marine space to be put aside, I'm really pleased about that. I appreciate working with Canada and really starting these discussions and trying to raise this idea at the local level in the coastal communities for them to understand what it means to have a marine protected area. So the Crees are working very hard to protect not only forests, wildlife habitats, water sources, but we're also trying to work on protecting our bay as well. And I think that one of the next steps for us is to really start talking about carbon and what that means for the Cree territory, because I truly believe that the work that we're doing doesn't only assist us in our vision to maintain a strong Cree cultural heritage, the Cree way of life, to sustain the biodiversity in our territory, but it also helps us to really be part of the international responsibility of contributing to the fight against climate. And for us, we know that we have many spaces that have significant carbon storage in them. And I truly believe that the work we're going to do is going to contribute to that on a very large scale. And I'm proud of my nation that, we've taken on this responsibility and we've taken on this challenge. And I only see success. And, some of the work that we do, we've had the opportunity to exchange with other nations. And I'm always looking forward to share and learn from other Indigenous groups in Canada that have undertaken the work of creating a protected area, and also sharing the things that we've learned in the process. I know that each nation will be working potentially with a different level of government, but for us here in Quebec, it has been a challenge, it has been a success at the same time, and we're always willing to share that information and pass on our knowledge too. In closing, I just want to acknowledge the other Iyut, the other Indigenous people that are going to be speaking at this conference. And I really appreciate that each of you has come to tell your story about your territory and what you're doing to work to protect it. I believe that Indigenous people are the leaders in conservation. And I truly believe that the traditional knowledge that we have is going to be something that's going to teach new stories to our non-Indigenous partners who work with us. If you are non-Indigenous, I strongly encourage you, the steps for reconciliation, there are so many. And it starts with small steps, such as being aware of your impact on the environment. I tell little kids when I speak to them, if you really want to make a change and if you want to support Indigenous people, do things like using products that are friendly to the environment, learn about Indigenous culture. It's really a responsibility to be open and to be open to be receiving that information. And sometimes it may be hard, it may be a hard story, but it's really going to encourage the resilience of Indigenous people throughout Canada. And I'm proud to be part of a nation that is able to exhibit that, and to be part of a team that has made a significant contribution to the work that's being undertaken to hopefully, and I truly believe that we will achieve this approach to being nature positive in Canada and throughout the world. So with that being said, like that.
Deputy Grand Chief, I think the entire audience would be standing up and cheering right now. I can hear them in their rooms and on their Zoom locations, because that was absolutely fabulous. And having both you and Harvey really embodying that two-eyed seeing, telling very similar stories around interconnected nature and having protected areas, and also having all of the wisdom of the cultural values. And I have personally been told about caribou from elders, and I learned a great deal from them when dealing in their territory. And so I know that it is important, it is exceedingly important to listen to the elders who have the wisdom of the land behind them. So thank you so much for sharing your story and giving us a view into how you developed this success. I have a couple of questions from the chat that I just wanted to share. One of those questions is just around this, or is around conservation as a concept, and then how Indigenous people see the worldview in terms of conservation. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that. But I would also say to that questioner that we are going to have 14 different Indigenous groups presenting over the next 3 days. And I'm sure you will get to hear a wide variety of perspective on Indigenous perspectives around conservation. But I'm wondering, Deputy Grand Chief, if you could share perhaps your view on what does conservation sort of mean in a context for your community.
I think in a modern day view, conservation means to set territory or set space aside that is to be untouched by any type of development, but to be open for us to continue, our practices as a Cree people. Traditionally, one of the stories that I heard when we were doing our consultations was, a long time ago, this elder had said when he was growing up in the bush, he had been born in the bush and he was traveling throughout his trapline with his grandparents. He remembers that they were on the shore, they were taking their boat on the shore. And as they were on the shore, he dropped something. I don't remember what he said it was, but it was something made out of metal, a small metal toy that he had. And when he dropped it, it fell into the water. And he thought that he lost it. He didn't bother to look for it. And his grandfather stopped. He stopped the boat, he stopped everybody, he stopped and he looked for that metal object that fell in the water. And he took it out, and it was a small toy. I think it was a jack, when people would play a jack and rubber ball. And his grandfather told him, "Agoi put stinjo on the bee," which means do not drop anything into the water. And for me, that concept of stopping to take the time to take even such a small object out of the lake is one of conservation, to the degree that traditionally people take the time to protect it, even from the smallest things. That's what conservation means to me. When you respect your water sources and your territory enough to make sure that you do not harm it with even a small object. So for us, that's been a principle that story really touched me. And, each and every one of us tries to undertake our work with that approach, to know that even the smallest object that can harm the environment is one that we have to pay attention to, not just these large projects or these large spaces that are impacted, that we have to remember that every drop of water is precious, and every drop of water that's impacted is one that we have to work to fight to protect.
Thank you so much. There's a great deal to learn from your presentation, and I appreciate you sharing it. Harvey, do you have any thing that you'd like? I have at least 20 questions, but I don't have the time to ask all of them. So I'm just going to ask this question, which is, Harvey, as you hear Deputy Grand Chief Mandy Gull speak, can you maybe reflect on some of what she has said and your presentation, just how the two sort of really are almost the same presentation, quite frankly?
Well, I'd like to start with, in Canada, we are in this marvelous position of realizing that we have a foundational layer that's very deep in our country, which is the First Peoples. Mm-hmm. And the First Peoples worldview, articulated beautifully by Mandy and by Elder Capreol, which is we share this world with the rest of life. And to a first person, life includes things like water and mountains and as well as what we call organic life, or they don't distinguish animate and inanimate the way we do. That worldview is exactly in line with Western science right now. Like 100%. We have to go somewhere fundamentally new in the way we relate to the world as a species, because we are damaging our home. So when I hear Mandy Gull talk about what the Cree have done in her part of the world, I'm just completely inspired, because that's exactly what all of us need to be thinking about as Canadians and as global citizens. And for me, this opportunity to get into the space of reimagining our relationship with the world, informed by science, informed by traditional perspectives, creating a new synthesis that gives us a stable climate, that gives us this nature positive future. And I'm so excited that we have this idea of nature positive. It's not doom and gloom and mitigation and reducing risk and all that kind of garbage. It's let's be positive. Let's dream about the world we want and let's go do it. And let's lead the world, Canada, in doing it. And I watched the story of the Cree and many other First Nations that I know around the country say, yeah, that's what we want. And also many people who are like me, who have come from a different tradition, who know we need to make change. And we have the frameworks, we have the knowledge. Now we just need the passion, the energy, and to get up and go and do it. So that's what I think.
Just to get up and go and do it. Well, with that, I'm actually going to close this morning's session. I want to thank Elder Capreol for kicking us off in a good way and leading with a land acknowledgement, and Deputy Grand Chief Mandy Gull for sharing her experience with the issue. Oh, I can't say the word. I practiced this morning and I've done a bad job. So I want to thank you very much for sharing the wisdom of the Cree and all you've done on the Quebec side to bring such an incredible vision to life. And Harvey, thank you very much for helping us understand a little bit more about the lay of the land, the importance of Ontario in the grand scheme of things, because it is a pretty important place when you look on a global perspective, especially when you overlap biodiversity and carbon. I appreciate you doing that. For everybody else, thank you for staying with us. I know we started a bit late this morning. We've gone a little bit late so that we could allow you to see all of the presentations. We're going to take a little bit of a break now, and then we're going to start with the presentation on decades in the making with Grassy Narrows, Moose Cree First Nation. We will also be hearing again from Elder Capreol as she is presenting with the coordinator for the Shawanaga First Nation IPCA. We're also going to be seeing this afternoon the Breathing Lands, which is going to be an incredible presentation, and you'll hear more about that later. And then we'll be hearing the Mushkegowik story about land to sea protection that they'd like to secure. And we're going to finish off today's session with a conversation with Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, the Federal Minister for Environment and Climate Change. And then Elder Capreol will close out the day. So stay with us. This is the link that you can use, and we'll answer all your questions, whether we do that live or do it after the session. So thanks so much. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.